in the middle of a terrible time right now in Canada and the world with the war between Russia and the Ukraine. And it needs some very serious and careful thought to decipher what's going on and to try and seek solutions for the future. With me today, I'm Dorothy Dobbie, the president of the former Parliamentarians, by the way. And with me today are three really knowledgeable members of Parliament from the past. We have Peter Kent, we have Breau, and we have Derrek Konrad. Hello, gentlemen. How are you this evening or this afternoon or this morning, whenever you're listening?
Hello. Thank you, Dorothy.
I think we'll start. We're going to have each of you give us a little bit of an outline of what you're thinking for a couple of minutes, and then we'll just launch into a regular conversation about this this event. So we'll start with you, Peter. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, my perspective, my attempt to address what Putin's trying to achieve with his unprovoked invasion and war crimes perpetrating attempt to recapture a nation that chose democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, his ambition to recreate greater Russia, imperial Russia, by forcibly reconstituting what he can of parts of the Soviet Union, is informed, I guess, by my years in journalism, as well as my time in government and opposition in the House. I was one of NBC News correspondents during the Gorbachev years and observed close up Gorbachev's Cold War terminating policies of glasnost and perestroika and the unintended collapse of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev liked Tom Brokaw, and our bureau enjoyed travel and access freedoms that most of the other news organizations covering the Soviet Union didn't. Gorbachev gave Tom the first wide-ranging sit-down interview in the Kremlin in 1987, when he pledged to continue reform policies and to seek nuclear détente. And that interview, although it didn't immediately achieve anything, it did foreshadow what was eventually the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I covered the final years of the Soviet Union across countries of the Warsaw Pact, particularly Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, Albania, and the occupied Baltic states, of course, and the Russian abandonment of its brutal decade-long occupation of Afghanistan. And relevant to what I passionately hope we'll see as an eventual end of Putin's miscalculated, barbaric Ukraine adventure, I remember our NBC crew in 1989 riding in a long convoy of Russian tanks, personnel carriers, and assorted support vehicles, following General Boris Gromov, who was leading the retreat of Russian ground forces from Afghanistan, trying at that time to portray the defeat as the completion of a fraternal operation to defend the country. Some of the same logic that we're seeing and hearing from Putin these days. Now, as a parliamentarian, I returned to countries of the former Soviet Union while in both government and in opposition. I represented Canada ministerially at Ukraine's ill-fated inauguration of the Putin protege, Viktor Yanukovych, in 2010, which was an event stage managed, effectively, obviously stage managed by Moscow, even to having the Russian Orthodox Patriarch of Moscow airlifted in to officiate. And we're hearing again today from Patriarch Kirill or in support of Putin's invasion, but his play is dividing, and we're beginning to see it spread. It's dividing the Orthodox Church around the world. I returned to Kyiv as an opposition member of the Foreign Affairs Committee a couple of years after Yanukovych was deposed by the Dignity Revolution, and he was, of course, eventually sentenced in absentia for treason and aiding an aggressive war, the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. But our committee at that time was impressed by the reforms that were underway across Ukraine's society and its government institutions. And we heard appeals then for continued and expanded military support of training, lethal defensive weapon systems, and the restorations of real-time battlefield satellite data, which had been suspended by the government in 2016. Canada's training initiative did continue very effectively. And I think it's contributed significantly to the inspirational resistance we've seen in the first weeks of the Russian invasion. And it's an apparent sore point with Putin, given that Russia fired as many as 30 cruise missiles, we're told, at the now vacant or supposedly vacant Canadian Army and NATO training base in Western Ukraine, very close to the Polish border. But Canada has been derelict, I believe, over the past 6 years in not delivering the lethal defensive weaponry and restoring the battlefield satellite data until just recently, weeks into the war. I only hope that belated supply of weaponry from Canada and the armories of the major NATO powers arrives in time, that Ukraine can stall Putin's mad adventure until sanctions take full effect. And I hope the democracies, and this includes the UN, although I'm not hopeful because they have a theoretical commitment of the responsibility to protect that the UN passed in 2005. But from the Secretary General yesterday and talking about the humanitarian tragedy, he did not once mention Russia as the invader. There's a lot to discuss here. Thanks.
Very interesting beginning. And if anybody is not speaking, could you please mute yourself because we can hear background noise, and if you don't mind. And now we'll go to Herb Breau. And that was very interesting. Thank you, Derrek. We'll come back with a few questions after we hear from everybody. Herb, would you please go ahead?
Sure. Well, thank you, Peter, for that intervention. I believe that there's going to be a new order of things. I hope that the Western world somehow in some fora is thinking about how you deal with Russia after, and it's clear that we're going to have to learn to live with regimes we don't like in a different way that we did before. When the world opened up to China, when Nixon went to China, and we had already recognized China, and then when the Bill Clinton administration and the George W. Bush administration kind of did the work to open up trade with China, of course, there were some advantages to the American economy because the Americans, as they do things, were using that to restructure the industrial economy. And they did. They did. Many industrial concerns moved to Asia, not only China, even if they were profitable in the US. So it was a restructuring of the American economy. But everyone expected that this would lead to more freedom, this would lead to more exchanges, as happened after the Helsinki conference. Because in essence, freedom and democracy will come from the people inside those countries. So we're going to have to find a way to at least change the rhetoric, if not the fundamentals, because there's nothing wrong with our fundamental positions, is we want all people to be free, and we want to recognize countries where they exist. But somehow the rhetoric and the narrative is going to have to change, and the fora are going to have to change. Let's hope that if this should end with, well, this will end one day, for sure. And I'm not sure we know what happens politically post-Putin. And that's a concern to me and a concern to some of my friends I've been talking about. I still have a lot of contacts in Ukraine. I was there 8 times, and I've been in other countries near Ukraine 4 times from 2006 to about 2011. And every time I would go there, I would always arrange to read about and meet government people, as close as possible to the government, because I was very curious about those people whom I admired from day one when I first was there. I had known a lot of Ukrainians here, but when you get there, it's a different feeling. They're a very proud people, very technically able, very well educated. So it seems to me that right now I don't understand what happens politically post-Putin. Are things going to be better? I mean, this is a huge area from near Japan to St. Petersburg to the Baltic Sea, 11 time zones. It's got internal challenges economically. So I'm spending time trying to think about what could happen. Clearly, I think as much as I dislike the Putin model, it's not really a government, it's more of a personal industrial enterprise. I have seen in the travels that I did there in Eastern Europe, I've witnessed interventions that came, obviously, we were told, directly from the Kremlin about people who were investing in places like Bulgaria and Hungary and even Ukraine. And all of a sudden, things were changed. And they said it came from the Kremlin. God knows if it did. So I believe that I was a bit encouraged to conclude my intervention. I was a bit encouraged by the interview. I don't know if you saw it yesterday from the Prime Minister of Finland with Christian Amandur. He seemed to relate, and as you know, Finland has a unique relationship with Russia. And he seemed to relate that there was still a political solution to this, that Putin is probably looking for a way out. The problem is that, according to him, he didn't want regime change anymore. The problem is that he wanted to enlarge the area in the east that he needs to go to the Sea of Azov, the Mariupol and Zaporizhzhia region. And that's an important region. So he seemed to relate, and of course he was being highly diplomatic and not very detailed in this discussion. So hopefully there's still a political solution to this. I don't want to, at a time of conflict, I don't want to spend time criticizing anybody politically, but you saw my displeasure with the way that the Western world, and particularly the Americans, managed this from 2014 on. But now is the time for us to unite and try to find new ways. So I'll be following that very carefully. And when this new order is set up, that we're going to keep in mind that the people we need to influence are the people inside those countries, so that they fight for freedom and they fight for democratic institutions.
Thank you. And you raised some very interesting issues. I think we're going to have a good conversation once we hear from Derrek. Derrek, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thanks for organizing this too and being patient on me getting online here. Things changed quickly. What was it, about a month ago, the three of us were going to co-write an article on Ukraine, and then all of a sudden things blew up, and according to Peter's words, we spiked the article because things were changing faster than we could get pen to paper.
Yes.
So here we are offering our perspectives based on our own experience and knowledge of what's going on there. That was it's been quite a ride. As we all know, there's total information overload on Ukraine right now. Nobody can take it all in. Dispatches come, photographs come. And so my experience isn't at the higher levels of government, it's more ground level. I was an election observer there on 8 different occasions, and every place that you will see in the news, I've been there to have contacts there and people who are on the front lines. I've been trying to contact some of them to see how they're doing, and so far I've only got 2 responses. And they have people on the front line. They themselves are out of country, but there are other ones that just aren't answering, including people in Poland. So a conflict like this is not only global, it's also personal, and I'm sure it affects all of us. Herb said he still maintains contacts in Ukraine. Oh boy, what can we say? First time I went there, I went along with 499 other Canadians in a reconstituted Canada Corps. I was seconded to the OSCE and was sent to Donetsk, where I've been twice. Lovely people, generous. They were so determined to get that next election right. That was the election in 2004 where downtown Kyiv looked like a war zone. Everything was all sort of Soviet. The train was what you'd expect in Soviet times. The election was on Christmas Day. Elections were held in unheated schools and places like that. I recall an older woman, quite old, way overweight, struggling up 3 stories of an old school to cast a ballot. And we worry about, and this is funny, in 2014, one of the questions we were to ask the, what do they call it? Well, anyways, the local election precincts, if they had ramps for people who were unable to manage stairs. I was embarrassed to ask such a question, but I was on a Canadian mission that time and you had to check the box. There were so many larger issues to discuss. Corruption, oh boy, that's what caused the runoff in 2004. It was the cause of essentially, well, as we know, there was also the Russian word drift of Yanukovych's government then in 2014. But corruption, everywhere I went, people were fed up with corruption. It affected them if they needed a driver's license. It affected everything. If they went to court, you got a decision, and the lawyer would ask you, how much? How much do you want to win this? It will depend on how much. What can I say? One other thing I just want to note. In the briefings that we had before we left Ottawa, the Ukrainian ambassador addressed us. And you know, the only 2 things I can remember from his comments were this: the correct pronunciation of Kyiv, and that we were not going to the Ukraine, we were going to Ukraine. And so I think really practically Putin needs to read a little bit of history outside of what was produced by Russian propagandists and make himself aware of what's the real facts before he acts. Anyway, that's
those are all very interesting
now.
observations, and particularly that sort of first-hand comment about the corruption, and just about to say that I've heard it said that well, the Finland issue is a very important one, that there might be some kind of a resolution there, and I'm glad you brought that up, Herb. But I was interested in your comments, Derrek, about the corruption, and there was some comment about the Americans having manipulated the last election. Is there any truth to that? Is that anything to do with what's happening right now?
I'm sorry, in my experience in the country ended in 2014. After that, I hit the age of irrelevance for sending out, because Canada won't send out someone over the age of 75. So what you read, what you know, is what you'll have to live with.
Does that seem plausible to anybody? Do you think that has anything to do with what's going on now, or is that just an outside comment?
No, I think President Zelensky was elected quite properly and legally. There may have been some correction of Moscow disinformation trying to influence. Ever since Yanukovych was run out of the country and found guilty of treason, some within the Russian population, certainly not all, but certainly in the Donbass area, those supportive of the Moscow interventions and sharing Putin's dream of joining a greater Russia have been at play. But I think the last election, it was very closely observed, and I think President Zelensky won. Corruption has been a problem over the years after decades of Soviet administration, which had its own forms of corruption and oligarchy. The nation is still, even as Putin invades, is still adjusting to democratic processes. When we were there with the Foreign Affairs Committee, we visited the huge improvements that had begun at the local police level, where, as you said, very often going to traffic court, it was a matter of who you pay off and how much. Reforms have worked very effectively in changing policing in Russia, in changing many of the governance issues that were there. The courts are certainly improving, although there's still some way to go, and that's been one of the problems that has prevented the country joining the European Union. But Ukraine has come a long way since it chose the West in 1991, and I think that there is still disinformation at play coming out of Russia and from Putin's cronies, trying to distract from what is really just a hugely unacceptable, barbaric attempt by Putin to fulfill part of his dream of restoring imperial Russia.
How do you?
Can I just add a little to the
do that?
Corruption thing? I want to give you just a little personal scenario that happened in 2014 in the parliamentary elections. I was there as a long-term observer and had got not a directive, but a suggestion from the central, from OSCE. If you feel comfortable, ask your winning members of the Rada if they spent any money under the table. And although at the precinct level, the district level, and the Central Election Commission level, observers were able to keep a pretty good handle on things. I want to give you their 4 answers. The first member was a really nice guy, let us know he was a Christian and all the rest. And here's the thing. I thought as a former member of parliament, I'm not afraid to talk to anybody and ask any questions. So I put it to them. And he looked at the sky, and he looked at the floor, and he looked all around, and he couldn't find an answer. He finally said, it's not always possible to obey all laws. The second member of parliament I asked said, well, I didn't intend to. And here you need to know that all members of the Rada run personal charities, and of course they run them for their own benefit as well as the benefit of others. And he said, well, there was a little boy who needed an operation his parents couldn't afford, and there was an orphanage where the heating system broke down, so I did. The third man I asked said, well, I was prepared to, but my polling showed I was far enough ahead that I didn't need to, so no, I didn't. And the last one, and I don't know if you've ever heard of Igor Lashko. He's associated with the Azov Battalion, which is a terrible organization. And he said, well, of course I did. And if anybody says they didn't, they're liars. So they're all caught up in it. You can't win an election without at least some level of dishonesty. And I saw it on the ground as I did my long-term observing, because we asked many, many people and read many, many newspapers, things like that. Anyway.
So one of the
to comment on your
just a half a second here, because it's relevant to this. One of the commentators I heard recently, an intellectual, said that he felt that this war would go on until Zelensky understood that his people were being slaughtered and he would have to come to an accommodation, and that accommodation might require some kind of, and I'm going back to what Herb said here, some kind of new relationship, which apparently was what was going on with the fellow you were talking about, Derrek, the previous prime president. Herb, what do you think? I mean, you mentioned new relationships earlier. What do you think about that?
Well, you saw in what I wrote earlier that I've been critical of the American decision in 2014 to isolate Putin, but you know, I don't have all the intelligence and all the information that they had when they decided to do that. So it's difficult for me to make, you know, an intelligent judgment about this. But there's absolutely no question that after the 2014 Crimea situation and the takeover of Crimea, and then the separatist who had the separatist states of the Northeast had started the troubles. There's no question that the Ukrainian psyche, the Ukrainian political class, interpreted that NATO was going to protect them. That is clear. All of my contacts there and all of the people I spoke, I continually speak to some. There's not 2 weeks that go by without having talking to some of them. Some of them are still in Ukraine, and some of them are in the UK, and some of them are in Toronto. Now, is it the Americans that really were pushing that, or is it Poroshenko at the time who determined that he wanted to really take a firm stand against Russia and didn't really make an effort to find a political solution? And then the Minsk agreements that were started by the French and the Germans, it appears that the Americans never really supported that. So it's difficult to say that the Americans manipulated the election or intervened in the election too much, because maybe that's what the Ukrainian political class wanted. And if they wanted it, because of their pursuit of freedom and wanting to develop democratic institutions, we would have to support them. It's their judgment. So I can't say who mustered that position, but clearly when Poroshenko went to the NATO meeting at the same time, if you recall, he came back with nothing, because the political class interpreted that if they stood firm, that NATO was going to be protecting them. And NATO is doing things, but we're not really protecting them. They're the ones who are dying, and they're the ones who are losing people. And here we are, and we say we're afraid to provoke a third world war. So clearly the Ukrainian citizenship has been misled, whether it's our fault or not.
Yeah.
So,
well, if I can jump in.
Yeah.
So they have to find a political solution with Russia. They don't have a choice.
Well, that's the question. Peter?
Well, I don't think there will be a political solution to this. I think the people to blame are the European governments that looked the other way, and so did we in Canada and the United States as well, after the invasion of Eastern Ukraine and the invasion occupation of Crimea. European countries didn't believe that it would go that much farther, or they couldn't bring themselves to believe it would go that as far as it has now. They continued to buy and deal with Russia for petroleum products, oil and natural gas. And by not reacting, they emboldened Putin. And Putin has been steadily, one of the great jokes about the OSCE is that Russia is a member under Vladimir Putin. The Minsk agreements were broken almost from the beginning by Russia. And the reason there were those who didn't like acceptance of the Minsk agreements or formal enactment of the Minsk agreements were that basically it disabled the ambitions, the democratic ambitions of Ukraine. So I think that the problem now is for the Western nations to realize, they keep saying they don't want to escalate the situation. Putin is escalating the situation by the day, and he's doing it against civilian populations of encircled cities. He's still ever approaching the border. We've heard reports today that some Russian weaponry has crossed the borders into Polish airspace, whether inadvertently or deliberately. And I think that it's time to basically I read an article in The Atlantic yesterday by Elliot Cohen, who basically argues very effectively that belatedly, as Canada and NATO begin shipping in lethal defensive weapons, the javelins and the stingers and so forth, but hold back on allowing Poland to move the MiG-29s in, there's no difference between those battlefield weapons. Battlefield weapons are, we have heard from NATO, we've heard from the democracies beyond NATO that they believe we should do everything in our power to allow Ukraine to defend itself. And by holding back some of this weaponry, and by not intervening, by not standing up to calling Putin's bluff on nuclear weaponry, that in fact we're doing what Clausewitz said. And Cohen had he ends his article with a great quote from Clausewitz, and he says, if one side uses force without compunction, undeterred by the bloodshed that it involves, and we're seeing it in Ukraine today, while the other side refrains, the first will gain the upper hand. We're dealing with we're in a proxy war. The war, those who say we're trying to avoid the Third World War, we are in the early stages, I believe, of a full conflict, and we are reminded regularly by historic references to the last century in Europe that appeasement never works, ever works. And I think that we have to stiffen the spine of all of the governments, both the European governments and of NATO.
That's a very good point. But of course, there's also some other factions in this, and that brings to mind China. And where do you think they're going to come down on this particular? I mean, I look at China and I say they are a nation of merchants. They want to create wealth. They've never really been invaders on a global scale in the past history of their whole world. So where do you think they're going to come down in this particular instance? Are they going to try and stay neutral? Are they going to try and befriend Russia? Or are they going to protect their own economic issues, which have to do with trade?
Well, I think we have to convince them that they shouldn't intervene and they shouldn't support Russia. You know, President Xi has made it quite clear he's seeking world domination. He wants to be the superpower. He's acquiring countries around the world in the developing world with economic diplomacy, basically debt diplomacy. He invited Putin before the Olympics. They had talks. They obviously are of the same anti-Western, pro-democratic mind. So I think that whatever the West, whatever the democracies do against Putin to end this invasion, it cannot extend to appeasement, because that will embolden not only Putin, it will embolden Xi.
What do you think about that, Herbert, Derek? Appeasement or
Well,
back?
we really, at least I couldn't read clearly the result of the meeting in Rome yesterday, because when I read about it, we had speculation on the US side, but there was really no quotes from the Chinese. I think the efforts that the Americans have been making for the last week or 10 days to put pressure on China is very important. It's critical. Whether China would intervene to create a world conflict, I don't think we can conclude that now. This could still be just a European conflict, even if there are skirmishes between NATO forces, whether they're from the air or other. I don't think we can conclude that China would jump in immediately, because China has succeeded in the last 70 years, thereabouts, well, 50 years really. I guess it's 40. 40 or 50 years, they've succeeded, in a period of stability. Whether it's to their advantage to risk destabilization, I don't know. I don't know enough about the China mind. People have been writing about and talking about the fact that Xi has a renewal of his mandate this fall. I don't know what that means. I don't know the extent to which the Communist Party has a real hold on all political movements. So I think there is a risk that if NATO goes further, and I think they're going to have to before too long, because we cannot allow what's happening now to go on much further. Either the talks that they're holding virtually now, promises a ceasefire relatively quickly, or not. I mean, something's going to have to happen. But I don't think it needs to conclude. I don't think it needs to lead to China becoming involved. It still could be just a European conflict for now.
Let's certainly hope.
Unless they intervene economically. If they bail out,
Russia.
they could, China could weaken sanctions against Russia if they start pouring money in the back door without getting involved at all in the conflict itself.
You will be involved.
I mean, we know that a lot of people are doing that now. I mean, clearly, sanctions are not, immune. Sanctions cannot be, anybody who understands how the world of business goes, sanctions cannot be 100% certain. So you're correct. Whether China intervenes militarily, Russia is a large supplier. The infrastructure is not there for them, but that can be looked after. But Russia remains a large producer of oil and gas and tremendous resources. So no, I'm not suggesting that China will not do that. I expect them to do that.
Derrek?
Well, as Herb said, sanctions are a leaky kind of a dam, and you just cannot stop everything. Of course, they're still exporting gas and oil to Europe, but I just want to take a little issue with what Herb said about we can't allow this to go on. I don't think it's ever even going to come to what we allow or don't allow. I think it's more like what we'll be dragged into. Russia is becoming bolder in attacking closer and closer to Poland. And I think one of these times they will forget themselves, make a major incursion, and that will trigger all of those articles that bring other nations into the conflict. As to China, I think I agree, they will act in their own self-interest. They may be close to Russia philosophically and geographically, but I don't think they're of one mind when it comes to are we willing to suffer the kind of consequences that even these limited sanctions will visit upon their economy. And they also have to worry about their relationship to Taiwan and the United States. They seem to have a backbone where Taiwan is concerned and don't want abandon the place to communist China. So it's a very complex situation. I just want to add one more personal thing. I was in Parliament when the decision was made to bomb Kosovo, and we were all given a free vote on that. And it was very difficult, and we were in no danger at all here in North America. The Russians stood by and allowed the West or NATO to do whatever it was going to do. But that was one of the hardest decisions I ever made, knowing that people were going to die partly as a result of a decision I made. Many soldiers serve their entire career and never have to make that decision. And so I feel for today's parliamentarians.
In terms of the sanctions, I mean, I haven't done the numbers because I don't have the resources to come to the numbers, and I'd have to seek an awful lot of help to be able to quantify what they mean. But if you're part of the oligarchy in Russia, and your wealth has melted by tens of billions of dollars, that's not something to go to the poorhouse for these people. And in terms of capital allocation over the midterm, let alone the long term, if you look at the resources of Ukraine, I'm not so sure that economically speaking and financially speaking, if I'm an economic advisor to Putin and in his industrial complex, because that's what it is. It's an industrial complex. He doesn't run a government. It's like you know, the owner of the country. The investment, the cost of the sanctions may be a worthwhile investment because Ukraine is a very rich country in terms of minerals, in terms of technology. I mean, you know, that's the reason Hitler went there, and it really caused him great harm in terms of his objectives. God knows if we would have been able to succeed past Normandy, if the Russians had not stopped Hitler in that area we're talking about now, Mariupol and the Sea of Azov and Zaporizhzhia and those regions. I mean, that's exactly where Stalin beat Manstein and Hitler. And Manstein was the brightest mind in the German army, coming from the Prussian military academies. And so in terms of the numbers of what these sanctions mean, if you're part of that oligarchy, that may be a worthwhile investment.
Which is not very encouraging, I must say.
Well, I mean, I'm not encouraging it. I'm not suggesting that we should encourage it. I'm saying if you're part of that group, because, you know, they're sticking with Putin. And here we are for 20 days, and there's been very little dissension among those people.
Mm-hmm.
And
but there will, if I can jump in, the sanctions will bite, and they are already beginning to bite. And I think if we take a look at Vladimir Putin, not as a politician, but effectively as a mobster, and many of those oligarchs as his various bosses, we can only hope that this terrible conflict ends with the removal of the mob boss by others in his closest circle. And we've seen that he's already taken a lot of his internal security folks. He's suspended them for misleading him, it seems. I've seen some of the documents that have been intercepted messages, and it seems that some of these people were allotted tens of millions of dollars to go in and basically buy Ukrainian civil authorities, ordinary citizens, to come to the streets and welcome Russian tanks, which rolled into the country basically with terribly trained conscripts. And when that it hasn't happened, and it's obvious that Ukrainians are standing together to resist. And it's a terrible thing to say, but they are pledged to resist to the death. Putin is now trying, apparently, to exert damage control against those who misled him. And while he may still resort to further escalation, further deadly escalation, I think there has to be a hope among NATO security forces and intelligence services that, in fact, Putin will be removed from within.
Let's hope that that happens. Let's hope that happens.
Folks, I'm afraid I've got to pull the plug and pull away.
Well, I was just going to
But good chat.
I was just going to wrap things up in saying that actually we've come full circle to what we see as the conclusion, which is that Mr. Putin has to somehow be removed, which is not going to be an easy task, because we know that he has a lot of fail-safes to make sure he's safe. I'm sure he's been in danger of being removed for a long, long time. I want to thank you all very much for doing this. I just want to close with a very interesting quote by Robert Service, who says, Putin despises democracy. He believes in the right of the leadership to impose the authority of the state on society. In the Russian president's view, this is good for citizens because it brings stability and practicability to their lives. If he believes that, if that's what his thinking is, we're not going to be able to reason with him. So I think your conclusion, which I think you're all coming to, that he probably has to be removed in some particular way, is the only conclusion we can reach. Thank you all very much. Maybe we'll do this again, and I really appreciate your time today. Have a good one.
Thanks, Dorothy.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Bye, guys.